Now being firmly back in the driver's seat, Satan, through the spirit of Wotan, then proceeded to use the German nation to do what he does best: steal, kill, and destroy. Using the newly acquired technologies of the Industrial Revolution and mass production, Satan then proceeded to manipulate the nations of the developed world into what would later be known as World War I. Germany, dominated by the spirit of Wotan and waving the standard of aggressive militarism and the accompanying ideas of racial supremacy, found itself leading the charge in this orgy of destruction and civilizational suicide. The demonic doctrine of survival of the fittest and the preservation of so-called favored races had unfortunately found its expression in the age of aggressive imperialism. The dominant nations, with no other foreign lands to conquer, now sought to conquer each other. War was declared in 1914. The resulting World War saw death and destruction take place on an industrial scale. With casualties amounting to over 17 million dead, whole empires, including the German Empire, destroyed, and most importantly for the Kingdom of Darkness, the destruction of an entire generation of Christian men. The satanic Reconquista of the West took a huge step forward. The spirit of Wotan reveled in the chaos. He was, after all, the god of war and death. As an indication of his direct and evil influence in the conflict, it is a point of note that the de facto military dictator of Germany during this war, one General Erich Ludendorff, Quartermaster General of the Army, was an avowed pagan who openly worshipped Wotan. It is reported that Ludendorff was not shy in performing ritual sacrifices to his god. Sacrifices, that is, aside from the thousands of human souls he daily sent to their deaths. All in all, though, the First World War was a great victory for the Kingdom of Darkness. Besides the widespread destruction and mass murder, there was also the added benefit of Wotan influencing the Germans to send noted revolutionary Vladimir Lenin back to Russia in the hopes of disrupting Russian society and its war effort. This ultimately led to, of course, the outbreak of the Bolshevik Revolution and the imposition of atheistic communism on the lands of the Russian Empire. This eventually spread to other parts of the globe. Interestingly, as a side note, this was yet another demonic doctrine espoused through a German philosopher, in this case one Karl Marx, an aspiring Satanist in his youth. This demonic doctrine would go on to enslave half of humanity, creating a living hell on earth for its various subject populations. It has so far resulted in the death of over 100 million souls and counting. It is another of Satan's gifts that just keeps on giving. But the devil and his minions were only just getting started, however. The war ended after 4 years, and it was followed by pestilence in the form of the Spanish flu, which claimed even more lives and great disruption. Satan, ever relentless, decided that there was now to be a part 2 to the carnage. After all, Christianity would not wipe out itself. Germany lost this war, and the prince of this world now decided that he, through the spirit of Wotan, would incite the proud nation to vengeance. And most useful of all, Wotan, god of war, now had at his disposal a large male population of discharged soldiers, trained bloodthirsty killers burning for vengeance. Helpfully for the Kingdom of Darkness, amongst the aforementioned army of trained bloodthirsty killers, there was found a man who would be the perfect vessel for their dastardly plans. He would be the human voice of Wotan, a new and exciting false messiah. This chosen vessel would be one that would not only lead the nation to its destruction, for Satan, no respecter of persons, hated the Germans, but would in the process destroy many other nations with it. A win-win situation for the Dark Kingdom, if ever there was one. God, over 2,000 years ago, speaking through his servant King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, decreed that it is he that rules among the kingdom of men, setting over it even the basest of men. In the matter of the vessel chosen to be the voice of Wotan and the ruler of Germany, this prophecy starkly came to pass. One could not, even if one tried, find a baser man. The vessel in this instance was a literal vagrant on the streets of Vienna before being saved from obscurity by the First World War. From all accounts, he was a man perfectly possessed by Wotan, in addition to perhaps many other spirits, from an early age. He was an ardent disciple of all the demonic doctrines espoused by those that came before him, an avid fan of Wagner, a follower of Nietzsche, a devotee of racist theoreticist Houston Chamberlain, and well versed in the esoteric doctrines of the various occult societies that flourished at the turn of 20th century German society. In other words, he was the veritable end product of over a century of demonic indoctrination. Even as a soldier during the war, he enjoyed the apparent divine protection of the spirits. He was seriously wounded at least twice, and while others were dying all around him, he miraculously survived the war. This uncanny luck would strangely follow him for the rest of his life. He is known to have survived numerous assassination attempts during the course of his earthly existence. Guided to power and given the supernatural ability to blind the minds of men, the vessel completely seduced the German people. With his hypnotic presence, he radiated the very essence of Wotan. He was able to touch the very soul of his listeners, telling them exactly what they wanted to hear. Before long, under the stewardship of this sock puppet of the demons, Germany, in the course of a few years of indoctrination, regressed to an almost total state of complete paganism, with old pagan practices and beliefs coming to the fore. Christianity and its values were repressed, and the people were back to the worship of nature. Their religion was a religion of race and blood, or, more particularly described, as blood and soil. Germany became their god, and the vessel was their Messiah, ushering in the new millennium, where they would rule the earth for 1,000 years. An earth that would be absent the presence of the other so-called inferior races, preparing for the further advancement of human evolution. Little did they know that they were merely to be the instruments of destruction of both themselves and others. They were mere tools in the demonic project of the discrediting of Christianity and the suppression of the gospel in the West. The Germans were simply one of the means by which the Dark Kingdom would regain its direct rule over first Europe and then the entire earth. Having secured total control over the nation, the spirit of Wotan, in full possession of the vessel, then proceeded to set the world on fire and launched what became known as the Second World War. Wotan was granted initial success in the early stages of the conflict by the Almighty, and within 2 years the vessel's army of darkness had conquered most of continental Europe. But even in the initial stages, the controlling and restraining hand of the Almighty was already evident. Total victory was not to be attained. The Almighty God is ruler of the universe, a universe in which Satan, the avatar Wotan, and the rest of the demonic host ultimately serve his purpose. He therefore allowed the conflict, though bitter and destructive, to take place in furtherance of his divine will. Like the ancient Assyrians of old, God ultimately used the Germans as the rod of his anger, In fact, his sovereign control was clearly evident even in the earliest stages of the war, when, in spite of the overwhelming superiority of the demonic forces, he prevented the total destruction of the British army at Dunkirk, allowing them to fight another day. But what could possibly be the source of that divine anger, one may ask? One answer could quite possibly have been the demonic plague of scientific racism, which at that time had the entire world firmly in its grip. This was particularly true in the Christian West, its main advocate and primary beneficiary. Racism and tribalism has always existed among mankind. It is one of the main tools of demonic control repeatedly employed by Lucifer and his angels throughout history. But with the advent of Darwinism, it exploded by leaps and bounds. It had received, in the eyes of wicked men, scientific justification. The Germans, a people never shy of taking an idea to its logical extreme, simply took this idea, albeit in the form of a fanatical crusade for racial hygiene or eugenics, to its murderous conclusion. Eugenics, it must be remembered, was at that time among the most prestigious fields of scientific endeavor throughout the then Christian West, and it remained at the core of the primary motivations for the horrors the Germans inflicted on mankind. In fact, their most infamous racial laws, laws that were used to justify their wholesale slaughter and oppression of millions, were copied almost word for word from eugenics laws passed earlier in the United States, the then beacon of freedom and democracy and flower of Western civilization. The racial attitudes regarding a hierarchy of mankind in which the northern Europeans stood at the top of the pyramid and the darker-skinned peoples at the bottom were sadly commonly accepted views among the Western nations, who eventually became victims of Nazi aggression. It was a situation in many cases of the chickens coming home to roost. Christianity, through its influence as both a guide and a restraint, had allowed the nations of Europe to develop into the most advanced, preeminent culture and societies mankind has ever seen. God granted these nations success in conquering the majority of the nations of the globe. The ultimate divine aim, of course, was to spread the light of the gospel and raise the brotherhood of man out of the darkness of savagery and demonic domination from which they, the nations of Europe, were themselves delivered centuries earlier. But the Western nations, in spite of their access to the truth, proved equally as sinful and corrupt as their counterparts then held in direct bondage to the kingdom of Satan. So successful was Lucifer's campaign to subtly undermine Christianity in the West, beginning with the Enlightenment, that little more than a century later the so-called Christian nations resorted to crudely taking advantage of their superior technical and material position, lording it over the native populations. This was rampant in the age of imperialism. There were of course attempts by heroic and courageous individuals and groups to spread the light of the gospel and their biblically inspired system of laws to the subject nations. But generally, the Western nations routinely engaged in a system of open plunder and the exercise of all manner of grave injustices against these populations in their pride and dominance. Thus, the widespread destruction and loss of life in the Second World War was allowed by God as both a rebuke and an apt demonstration of the murderous consequences of these vile and widely held evil beliefs. When the war was over, the combined estimated casualties of over 80 million dead, and with the subsequent revelations of all the horrific excesses perpetrated by man against his fellow man in that period, there remained no moral or, for that matter, scientific justification for scientific racism, hierarchies of mankind, and the excesses of colonialism. And then, of course, there was the issue of the Jews. A look through the annals of history would demonstrate that a particular feature of a nation dominated by the kingdom of darkness is its widespread hatred of the Jews. It would appear that Satan and his demons have an unquenchable loathing, an unrelenting hatred for the Jewish people. Given the study of the Scriptures, there can be little doubt as to why. Not satisfied with corrupting their manners, religious practices, and beliefs. Not satisfied with blinding their minds to the truth, to a stubborn and stiff-necked opposition and rejection of their own Messiah, Satan, it would appear, has gone out of his way to persecute, oppress, and murder persons identified and belonging to this particular faith. This has been a frequent occurrence throughout the entire world, be it the nominally Christian West, the Muslim world, and even in modern, officially atheist nations such as the Soviet Union and its now former communist satellites. Anti-Semitism, it would appear, is a demonic disease. This disease would frequently take the form throughout history as murderous pogroms and/or official state-sponsored acts of discrimination, such as restrictions to particular professions and isolation in ghettos, just to name a few. However, when Germany became the first nation to abandon Christianity and return to paganism, the subsequent influx of demons through the egregore of Wotan, the so-called racial soul of the nation, hatred of the Jews, was elevated to hitherto unforeseen heights. Nowhere in the entirety of the unfortunate history of mankind would we be allowed to get a purer insight into the sheer level of destructive and malevolent hatred that Satan has, not only for this group of people, but by extrapolation, humanity in general. The kingdom of darkness, through its emissary Wotan, used the vessel and his willing accomplices, being for the most part the entire German nation, and its like-minded allies throughout Europe, to commit acts of human evil and depravity on the Jews that would ensure that the name of Germany would stink to high heaven for centuries to come. Demons bedecked in the shells of their willing human subjects were given free rein. The Jews were murdered on a literally industrial scale, with factories of death being constructed for the specific purpose of extermination. In all, Wotan, in his terrible fury, consumed at least 6 million of these unfortunate souls. Indeed, Wotan's fury was so vile in character, so all-consuming, that even in the later stages of his reign of destruction, when the war was clearly lost and resources were scarcely available to continue fighting, the extermination and persecution of the Jews remained amongst the highest priorities of the vessel and his accomplices. But alas, the war, at least for Germany, was lost. With the Germans and their allies, he had destroyed wonderfully. It was now, however, time for Wotan to move on. But before he departed, he would use the vessel for one final murder, himself. After the trauma and tragedy of 2 world wars, the world has been forever changed. The ruler of darkness, surveying the scene, was enjoying his moment of triumph. Europe has been reclaimed. Wotan has served well, and now, having wreaked worldwide havoc, he will retreat once again to the shadows until he is needed. It would now be relatively easy to destroy the last remnants of belief in Europe. Half of the continent would now be falling under atheistic communism, and the other half would be so consumed with tragedy and guilt they would be begging for a break with the past. In this case, the Christian past. Someone or something has to take the blame for the catastrophic horrors visited on the world. One thing the Prince of Darkness knew for certain was that man in his pride will not take responsibility for the current state of affairs that was a result of nearly 2 centuries of secular enlightenment. No, that would be an admission of failure. Ever since he, Lucifer, seduced the first humans into rebellion and sin in the garden, they have always looked elsewhere to cast the blame for their failures. Failures resulting from their desire to go their own way, to be independent of God, to be their own God. He fondly remembers Adam's first excuse for sin and disobedience. "It was the woman you gave me," not so subtly blaming his creator for his predicament. And like Adam, Satan was sure that his descendants would adopt a similar approach. Religion, in actual fact Christianity, would have to take the fall. To fill the vacuum, secularism would take its place. Having recently discovered the secret of splitting the atom, man in his pride would be even more full of himself. He would become his own god. And with that course of action, paganism having been buried on the continent for almost 2,000 years by Christianity, would triumphantly return. When man would become God, his lust and desires become the object of his worship. He would worship only what he is able to identify with his senses, what he can see around him. He would worship the creation and not the Creator. That is the essence of paganism. With man's mind blinded by materialism, Satan would regain his rule relatively unhindered. Science, the worship of the environment, and a sexual revolution will therefore be his new tools of control. Welcome to the glorious age of secular humanism. Europe has fallen. One more obstacle to go.